2 weeks ago.
Recording in progress.
David, who was the king who established the institutional continuing monarchy in Israel, who presided over the transition from the Tribal Confederation via the halfway house of Saul to establishing a dynasty, which for a considerable period of time had an existence. Today, we're going to move on to one of his sons, Solomon, who turned that established monarchy into a regional empire and one of considerable wealth and considerable extent. If you just look at it quickly, in terms of the succession, if you've got a successful king like David who dies of natural causes, and he's succeeded by a designated son who then becomes a successful king, if you put it that way, it all looks pretty smooth and predictable. But that's how it appears in retrospect. And in fact, as it was unfolding, the succession was not at all that simple. Although David on his sickbed during his terminal illness, apparently at the urging of his wife Bathsheba, already provisionally designated his son by Bathsheba, Solomon, to be his heir. But the politics of the harem intervened. Polygamy in that part of the world was common among wealthier people. Among those who were private persons, I guess it was probably mostly recreational or a matter of prestige. But when you begin to deal with the royal house, it's a different matter. It has political importance. You get into what's called the politics of the harem. Different heirs by different mothers are going to automatically be rivals. I don't know if any of you have been to Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. They have an area there where the heirs to the Ottoman monarchy were put up in separate quarters so they wouldn't kill each other. And the primary designated heir lived in what was known as the Golden Cage, a place where he was educated, pampered, protected, kept from being slain by his brothers. It wasn't quite that way in ancient Israel, but when you had multiple wives with multiple children, the wife's future depended heavily on what her son managed to do in consolidating his position.
And was it true, Doug, that customarily the designated son killed all his brothers?
Well, in the Ottoman Empire,
Yeah.
well,
Not the,
to some extent, but the major task was to avoid being killed by all his brothers, to be protected. Yeah, to some extent. It's an interesting place to visit if you have the opportunity to be in Istanbul. Now, what happened as David was approaching death was an incident of the politics of the harem. One of his sons, Adonijah, was the child of a relatively non-entity wife, Haggith. He, however, did not accept David's designation of Solomon to be the heir. Adonijah raised a rebellion, beginning in rudimentary form before David died, but then blossoming on David's death. And Adonijah had considerable background in the military and himself had a certain warrior tradition. And Adonijah gained support from one very important supporter, Joab, who was the commander of the army. And also Abiathar, who was one of the candidates to become the chief priest. He was not at the time the chief priest, but he was in convention. And with their backing, he raised an armed rebellion and he declared himself king. Bathsheba played a critical role in this. Her position allowed her to, and her ambitions, I would say, required her to. And she intervened. From the time David first met Bathsheba, when she was, didn't meet her at that time, admired her when she was bathing on an adjacent rooftop, he was clearly smitten with her. She was the love of his life. He had at least 8 named wives and probably many more that were not named. The biblical writers didn't tend to identify or give much biography on women who didn't have influential sons. He may well have had dozens of wives, and he certainly had maybe hundreds of concubines. But Bathsheba was his favorite. And once they married, and I think you probably all know the story of his noticing her bathing on an adjacent rooftop and thinking she looked pretty cool. From the time they married, no other woman ever rivals her influence over David. And she intervenes with the dying David to bring about the formal anointing of Solomon as his heir. This is before David dies, but when he's in terminal stages. In order to counteract Adonijah's support from Joab, the army commander, and Abiathar, the chief priest candidate, she enlists supporters to reinforce Solomon's position. One of the most important is Nathan, whom we saw briefly last time. I think he could be described, some describe him as a prophet. I think I might describe him as David's court chaplain. And Zadok, who is an alternate to Abiathar, is one of the candidates for chief priest. Her coalition prevails. Adonijah sees that he's outgunned. He withdraws. Solomon is crowned, reportedly with overwhelming popular approval, but that, after all, is what the historians who supported Solomon reported. Adonijah concedes, and Solomon, in what is regarded by some as an indication of his wisdom and tolerance and moderation, pardons Adonijah. But on a condition. Adonijah is on parole, so to speak, and he guarantees Solomon that he's not going to take a further role in dynastic politics. He breaks that promise, and Solomon has him arrested and executed. And from that time on, Solomon no longer has a credible challenger. He's been anointed, he's been coronated, but now it's clear that he is the new king. What's Solomon like? What are his personal qualities? There are a lot of people who testify to these personal qualities, and there's so much testimony to that effect that one has to believe that there's some substance to the descriptions. He's clearly clever. He's clearly ambitious. He's astute. He understands politics. He understands people. He understands maneuvering. He has diplomatic skills. He knows how to get what he wants by positioning himself and winning the approval of other people. By all accounts, he's a cultivated man. He's learned. He has a wide range of intellectual interests. He presents himself well, and that's important. He also has, and we'll talk about it more later, a taste for the grandiose. Reminds one a little of Joe Stalin, for instance, with his construction of large, impressive buildings that sometimes go well beyond the practical needs. And arguably, he's pleasure loving. Okay? He's not a warrior. David was a warrior. David had an established reputation, whatever one makes of the David and Goliath incident, later on of being involved as a commander in the war with the Philistines, being brave, being successful. He's a warrior king to start with. Solomon isn't. Solomon is an administrator, not a warrior. Solomon has a reputation for wisdom. That's something I'm going to talk about in greater detail later. You'll see that I may conditionally endorse that characteristic. Solomon brings to the throne some inherited assets, some things which David has already established and which he can build on. David has established Jerusalem as the acknowledged political capital. He's established it as a recognized cult center through bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and building the Tabernacle.
Doug,
Yeah.
in your, as you researched this, what was your understanding about the difference between where David placed the tabernacle and where it ultimately ended up? Was there,
You mean,
did he keep it in the city of David, or did he keep it outside the walls of the city of David?
I expect it was in the city of David because that was the city of David.
Yeah.
The expansion, which we'll talk about a little later, onto Temple Mount
Took place later.
took place mainly later. There may have been some small settlement there, but it wasn't an administrative center. And according to any of the reports I've seen, the tabernacle was located in the city
In
of
the city
David.
of David.
The tabernacle, as I may have indicated last time, was kind of a wooden frame structure of a fairly large dimension that had cloth hangings all around it. It was sort of like a tent reminiscent of what it had been during the days of the wanderings, at least symbolically reminiscent of it, but over a frame structure.
Right.
It became, as I mentioned last time, the seat for the Ark of the Covenant, which was housed in the tabernacle. David had created a sizable professional army, and he had an institutionalized civil bureaucracy. It's hard to tell exactly what the dimensions were, because again, the accounts probably exaggerate the force that he acquired. He certainly had trusted advisors. And as far as one can tell, he left a financially solvent realm to his successor. I'm reminded when I think of this as the relationship between Henry VII and Henry VIII in England. Henry VII being a very judicious, wise, moderate, well, responsible monarch who built up the wealth and built up the treasury And then Henry VIII turns around and spends all of it on wives and foreign wars and things like that. Well, Solomon inherited, as far as we can tell, a solvent monarchy. David had expanded the borders of Israel through both conquest and diplomacy. The conquests were of minor neighboring states. David's military force, with the exception of the Philistines, whom he didn't conquer, but whom he repelled, they were minor states that were fairly easily dominated, but he did expand the borders. And the map that I had drawn, wherever it went, over here, basically portrays the borders in David's time. Solomon expanded those further, and I'll deal with that a little more. It was a period of benign international environment, which largely continued into Solomon's day. There were, for the time being, the major powers in North Africa and the Middle East, Egypt and Assyria at that time, and later Babylonia rising and all, were not in an expansionist mood. We'll see when we get next week to Josiah that the situation was very different. Assyria had been on the march and Babylon was rising and Egypt was playing again. But that wasn't the case during David's reign, and it wasn't the case during Solomon's reign. It was a benign international environment where there were constant minor wars, but there was no threat from a major rival power. Solomon built on David's legacy, and he did it in even more favorable times because by then the Philistine threat had largely disappeared. What were some of his programs and some of his policies? Very important was territorial expansion. And what we see here, actually then under Solomon, got expanded further up into the north and toward the coast, never reaching the coast, but getting close, and moving down into Sinai and moving down into this area on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba.
Did it ever cross the Jordan?
Yes, yes, it did. And it was an interesting kind of expansion. It wasn't accomplished through conquest, not by and large anyhow. It was accomplished through diplomacy. And included in the diplomacy was the commercial aspect, trade, and the marrying of the daughters of foreign rulers. The extended territory under Solomon was the greatest that ancient Israel ever nominally controlled. That was the high watermark on the map. It hadn't been there before, and it never came back to there afterwards. It ranged from the edges of the kingdom of Damascus in the north, which is up in here, okay, approaching but not really completely reaching the Mediterranean coast in the west, into Transjordan in the east, across the Jordan River, and down into Negev and the Red Sea littoral in the south. But the degree of control was not uniform, it was not absolute. In core areas, Solomon undertook widespread construction of defensive strong points, and we'll talk about them a little more later. He built walls to fortify cities. He built fortresses. He made use of conscription to provide the military manpower to occupy these strong points. And he used forced labor, the corvée, in later parlance, not what the Israelites called it, to do much of the construction and the operation of his facilities. And we'll see when we get near the end and talk about a balance sheet on his strong points and his weak points, that conscription and the corvée were controversial policies. Archaeological remains attest to the extent, if not always the purpose, of Solomon's new construction. The built infrastructure footprint from David's monarchy is meager. Pieces of walls here and there, and that's about it. It led and has led some contemporary observers to question whether David was really a powerful king at all, because you can't find a lot of the material remains from David's period. Partly, however, that's because many of them were built over later. Solomon leaves an abundant footprint of material remains. It's extensive and it's easy to discern. You can find where it is and you can find where it extended. The purpose of Solomon's construction is not always clear. One of the famous discoveries 30 years ago, maybe a little more than that, was the excavation of a large building at Megiddo in the northern part of Israel, which at the time was labeled Solomon's slavery, Solomon's stables. The literary record attests the fact that Solomon imported large numbers of chariots from Egypt and used them extensively for intimidation, if not in actual warfare. Where there were chariots, there must have been horses. Where there were horses, there must have been stables. And when they uncovered this large building in Megiddo that seemed to have compartments in it, they decided it was Solomon's stables. Later on, when more critical archaeologists began to look at it, they decided maybe it was a warehouse for storing grain. Well, granary, stables, who cares, really? In either case, it was a very large scale building. It was a sophisticated building in terms of its construction techniques. It surpasses anything remaining from David's reign and probably surpasses anything that David ever built. This was true of other fortifications as well. This was true of the construction later on what is now known as Temple Mount, of the walls around the area where the temple was, both in terms of technique and in terms of the scale. It was impressive. Economic development was important in Solomon's reign. The new construction of both public buildings and private buildings documents a high degree of economic development. At sites of archaeological excavation, there are a great number of luxury goods. That's a further indication of prosperity. And there are a large number of imported goods. And the commercial and industrial installations, some of them warehouses, some of them distribution points, some of them industrial installations, are found not only in urban locations, but sometimes as self-standing features in what are otherwise rural areas. This is especially true down here along the Gulf of Aqaba and along the Red Sea littoral. There are ports there, and in the ports there are warehouses, and adjacent to the ports there are mining and manufacturing facilities, but they're not big cities. The mining and manufacturing facilities are adjacent to mineral excavation locales. Down in this area, there are a lot of processing plants for minerals. There's a fiction tradition about King Solomon's mines, which figured in a novel and which figured in a movie. The idea was that there were rich copper mines located over in this area, and that a great deal of Solomon's wealth depended upon them. More recent archaeological examination of King Solomon's mines says, yes, indeed, there were rich deposits of copper there, but they had been exhausted and abandoned before Solomon's reign. And King Solomon's mines are largely a fiction. What was not a fiction was that he was a copper king, but it was based on something other than King Solomon's mines. It was based on trade, on transfer trade, on reprocessing. Copper ore was imported from the Arabian Peninsula down here and manufactured into finished goods or higher grade ore in facilities along this area. So to call him a copper king is perfectly appropriate. To say that resulted in a fair amount of his wealth is correct. To attribute it to King Solomon's mines, like a lot of things we run across, is not quite true. The trade routes, primarily going north and south from Israel proper. The northern routes led up through, and this map with the two colors represents later the divided kingdom, but the United Kingdom under Solomon incorporated all of those things. The northern route goes from the northern part of Israel out to the Mediterranean, out to Tyre and Sidon, which were during that period ruled by a king, Hiram, who figured earlier in David's construction of his palace and later in Solomon's construction of the temple. That trade route carried a variety of indigenous agricultural goods that were destined for export. And it brought back manufactured items, particularly imported manufactured items that came in through the Mediterranean ports, especially iron goods. Although there was some iron manufacturing in Israel at the time, it wasn't a true Iron Age society at that point. It was a late Bronze Age society in terms of what it manufactured. And it brought in a variety of luxury goods, spices, other exotic foodstuffs. Most of these were of overseas origin. There wasn't a great deal on the route between Israel proper and the ports. On that northern route, Israel had an unfavorable balance of trade. It imported more than it exported. How did it cover that imbalance? Interestingly, by acquiring new territories in the north from minor neighboring states, acquiring them through diplomacy, marriage, and other clever means, and then ceding them to Hiram in Tyre and Sidon in exchange for compensating funds to cover the deficit in the trade. The southern trade largely consists of exports of mineral products, either the re-export of imports or things from adjacent areas. Especially these were copper ore and processed copper products and manufactured products derived from them. They tended to originate near the Red Sea and the Aqaba ports. It was a local trading route by and large in terms of its exports. The coastal areas in the south supported the processing and were industrial centers, but not urban locations. Other imports into those ports and then up the trade route into Israel proper came from areas farther away, from areas in the east, from perhaps areas as far as the Indian subcontinent, and especially from Africa. The Queen of Sheba features in the literature in this regard. We'll talk about her a little more later, but whatever brought her to come in contact with Solomon, whether she was searching to learn from his wisdom, which supposedly was widespread in reputation throughout the region, or whether she was trying to expand commerce, or whether there was a romantic dimension to it all, is not clear. But there was certainly a commercial dimension. There was an active trade between the areas in East Africa and the southern part of Solomon's kingdom. And that trade was both a seaborne trade, following the monsoon winds up the coast from East Africa, from Somalia and East Africa, and an overland trade. Okay. Important then in an international, regional, commercial sense. Already mentioned that Solomon was a builder. He sponsored a great deal of public construction throughout Israel. They were administrative buildings, they were fortresses, they were defensive walls surrounding cities. They were warehouses and manufacturing facilities. They were aqueducts. They were irrigation infrastructure. His most famous and largest construction project was, as you all know, the temple in Jerusalem. A thing of considerable extent, which consumed a large amount of funds and took a long while to build. It was located on Mount Moriah. Why is Mount Moriah known to people who read the Bible?
Sacrifice of Isaac. The sacrifice of Isaac.
Yeah, this was the least reputed site where Isaac was to be sacrificed and where the ram was caught in the thicket, and animal sacrifice then nominally replaced human sacrifice. That whole question of human sacrifice in that region is an interesting one. The Canaanites practiced certain kinds of human sacrifice, and one of the common forms was the sacrifice of young children.
Something that Jeremiah says is still going on among the people.
It's something that was still going on, and not just in areas that weren't controlled, but in areas that were controlled by Israel. And Jeremiah, is a relatively late figure, or a very late figure, in the divided kingdom. Okay. The idea of human sacrifice I guess, was seen as a way of mollifying the gods in return for the grant of fertility.
Or in the case of Agamemnon, military success.
Yeah,
Fair winds and following sea.
yeah. Now we're dealing with a different culture. when we get
Yeah,
to
but
that.
it was a prevalent practice throughout the world.
Oh, sure, sure.
As we know from Aztec culture.
Yeah, but I think in the Canaanite context, it was seen as mostly fertility connected. The whole question of when and how Israelite forebears may have practiced human sacrifices, one that's pretty hard to.
But that for the fertility you're talking about is not just about having more children, it's about the crops.
And it's about the animals,
It's about survival.
and it's about the
It's
animals,
fertility
yes.
Part from which survival would
Mhm.
be in
Yep.
jeopardy.
But it all, fits into a larger pattern.
Yeah.
The deities were fertility deities, and they were responsible for the fertility of many things, including human beings, but also included agricultural products.
Something we believe about God as well.
Yeah, you want to add another word on that?
Well, just because we continue to have rogation festivals.
Yes.
and,
Yes,
we
no
have
question
prayers,
about it.
we have prayers for the crops.
Yep.
And blessings of hounds and all kinds of things.
All kinds of animals, all kinds of primitive Christian religions bless animals in various locations. Okay, the temple is built on Mount Moriah, the at least traditional site where Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son. And the fact that it was a location of sacrifice was important. Solomon built the temple, or the temple complex more appropriately, as an enhanced central cult center. It was a rival to the high places, which we discussed a little bit last fall when we were talking about the prophets. The high places were rural locations, most of them on mountaintops, that had been places of sacrifice going back even before the conquest, that were adopted by the Israelites and continued to be rural cult centers where sacrifice of various kinds was practiced. And they contributed to decentralization. That is a political liability from Solomon's point of view. It's a liability in terms of ritual purity, but it's just a liability in terms of regionalism and political control as well. And so the temple in Jerusalem, which is a successor in function to the tabernacle which David established in Jerusalem, is a rival cult center which is supposed to draw attention away from the high places and limit their influence. There are dozens of predecessor holy sites scattered throughout mostly northern Israel, known as the high places, because most of them were on mountaintops, but not all of them. What was the function of the temple? Principally, it was a place of sacrifice. And that underlines the connection, legend or whatever else, to the location of Abraham's intended sacrifice of his son. It dealt in various commodities that were sacrificed, mostly in the form of burnt offerings. They were intended to please God, to mollify God, to reconcile his people to his creation, to, in a sense, with animal sacrifices, ask God's permission to kill an animal for a worthy purpose. They were also a resource for food supplies. This was particularly true in the case of animal sacrifices. Not all sacrifices were animal. There were grain sacrifices. There were sacrifices that involved the burning of oils. But the principal and most important sacrifice was animal sacrifice. And it was not just a ritual, but it was a way of providing a ritually clean food supply. And major animals were rather difficult to slaughter in your own backyard. It was permitted. Right? But when you're talking about slaughtering a bull, you need more infrastructure than that to do it. And in a way, the temple was a gigantic barbecue center.
So it was a cookout.
Hmm?
It was a cookout then.
It was a cookhouse. And it was not the only place sacrifice could be offered, but it enjoyed an economy of scale. The animals could be provided there. Sometimes people brought animals with them to be sacrificed. More often, in the case of large animals, they were procured locally in the outer precincts of the temple. Okay? It was a site, in many cases, for one-stop shopping. You could get what you needed, and then you could process it in the same general location. It had the ancillary function of being a pilgrimage destination. And because it was a pilgrimage destination, it was a place of celebration. But you don't want to think of it in the image of a church offering corporate worship to a resident clientele. That wasn't that. It was a place where people assembled, where they took pilgrimages, where the pilgrimages involved singing and dancing on the way and similar celebrations after arrival. But it's not a church. It's not really a predecessor of the later synagogues. The architecture of the temple, it was a large rectangular structure, and it had, here I'm talking about the temple building, not the whole complex, had two separate interior spaces. The smaller one that was located at one end of the rectangle was known as the Holy of Holies. And it centered on the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was roughly a 2 foot by 4 foot ornately decorated box in which was contained 2 sets of the tables of the law. One, the set of tables that were broken in Sinai, and one, supposedly the ones that then replaced them. And some people say it contained a written copy of the Torah as well. Which period that was true of is a little hard to determine. The previously portable shrine that was the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Jerusalem by David and temporarily housed in the tabernacle, but then brought to the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies could be entered only once a year on the Day of Atonement, and only by the chief priest. The remainder of the temple building was used for priestly ceremonies primarily, and how much public participation there was in those ceremonies is open to a certain amount of question. But you had the 2 compartments, the larger one that was the holy area and the smaller one that was the Holy of Holies. The temple building was surrounded by a series of courtyards, and they were hierarchically arranged. The one closest to the temple was a place where the priestly sacrifice was conducted. It was bordered by a spectator space that was open only to male Israelites who were ritually clean. Then a little farther out, there was a court of women, and that was a precedent in later Jewish practice for seating the women in a separate section of the synagogue. I attended a decidedly non-Orthodox Jewish facility in London called Christ Church in Hampstead, a faux Gothic building that looked a great deal like the one we're currently occupying, although it had a taller spire. It was high church, and I was interested to discover in my time in England that high church was ritually perhaps more elaborate and formal, but in mood, it tended to be more informal and casual and friendly than the lower churches, which they referred to as being evangelical, and which were more earnest and which were closer to, in some areas, the conventional Presbyterian way of doing things.
More Pharisaical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that too, maybe. In this case, was presided over by a vicar. What's the distinction between a vicar and a rector? We have rectors, they had vicars,
But
but
technically, I think a vicar is a servant more directly of the bishop. In the United States, we have things called vestries.
Yeah.
Invented in Virginia.
yeah,
And the vestries call and elect the rectors. In the United Kingdom, all the rectors are installed by the decision of the bishop.
forgive me for an irreverence that comes to mind here, but you're familiar with that story where someone has fallen on the ice and is described as having fallen on his ass, and somebody corrected him and said, no, you can't say that, rectum. And they said, rectum damn near killed him. Well, I don't know how the
So
rectors.
vicar comes from the word vicarious. I believe.
Yeah. Well, vicar is someone who stands in the place. of
Stands in the place of the bishop.
And stands in the place of Christ, for that matter. I mean,
In a sense.
the Pope is the vicar of Christ.
With it.
Well, to those.
Right. He's a vicar. He stands in the
Yeah,
place of that.
stands in the place, yeah.
Aren't some mission churches are certified vicars?
Right, because they don't have they're not self-governing because they're receiving income from the diocese. This parish for many years received assistance from the diocese and from the Church Missionary Fund to pay its rectors. It still called them rectors, but in a sense they were subsidized vicars.
And when I started that story, what I was going to suggest actually was Kit Fox, who was the vicar's name, interestingly enough, and a very genial
Kit
young man.
Fox.
Kit Fox, yeah.
Of course, Kit is a fox's offspring. Right?
Yep. But a popular nickname in the UK too. His wife was Jewish, and she would always attend in the sanctuary. There were no spaces other than the sanctuary related spaces in the main building. Other things were in ancillary buildings. And the nave had side aisles on either side. And one of the side aisles was used for the coffee hour. And his wife was in charge of the coffee hour. And she attended all the services, but didn't participate in. And it was like a reflection of the idea in the synagogue that the women were located in a separate section. So we had a hierarchy of courtyards around it, some for priests, some for clean males, some for women, some open to people who were not circumcised Jews or not clean in a ritual sense. The various courtyards contained ritual objects. And I'm not going to go through too many of them, but there was a lot of ornamentation that was both expensive and elaborate. Some modern commentators have asserted that the ornamentation contained half the gold supply of the ancient world. I don't know how you measure that, but it was a rich treasure trove. And when the temple was plundered by the Babylonians, they knew what they were doing in terms of what they went in and recovered and hauled away. That probably is an exaggeration, but it certainly was a significant accumulation of treasure. Supposedly, the temple and its ornamentation was paid for by voluntary subscription. Hard to say. Solomon used the corvée of forced labor for many projects, but maybe it was considered inappropriate for the temple building. It's not documented in connection with the temple. Beyond the temple building, beyond the construction project, biblical accounts attribute great wisdom to King Solomon, at least during the earlier parts of his reign. The Book of Kings relates a dream that Solomon had in which God asks him what gift he should bestow on Solomon in order to facilitate his reign. And Solomon is reported to say, wisdom to rule my people and an understanding heart. Well, maybe he said that. The Book of Kings also suggests that the Queen of Sheba, as I mentioned before, sought out Solomon to learn from his wisdom. Other possibilities are romance and enhancement of trading reputation relations. Jewish tradition attributes 3 books in the Bible to Solomon as the author: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. The attribution is not reliable. The 3 are very different in content and style from each other, and there's nothing particularly persuasively to link them to Solomon. The subject's too complex to even begin to deal with here, even for me. Some traditional sources attribute thousands of proverbs to Solomon. Solomon may have uttered a lot of proverbs, probably not 1,000. Such attribution is somewhere between highly impossible and very highly impossible when you're talking about the thousands. All I'd be prepared to say is that there is so much smoke about Solomon's wisdom to suggest there must be some fire there. But whatever wisdom Solomon possessed, he did not always consistently exercise it in his style of governance, especially in the latter part of his reign. There were, in fact, a number of problem areas mentioned in Scripture with respect to Solomon's reign. The biblical accounts of Solomon's achievements and failings are found in 2 separate collections of books of the Bible, Kings and Chronicles. Kings is the earlier of the 2 books. It was put together in its roughly current form, probably as much as 200 years after Solomon's reign. Some of the material incorporated into it certainly came from contemporary accounts originated in Solomon's time, but it's hard to say definitely how much came from that period and what contemporary material was actually incorporated in its original form. We have references to the titles of some of those earlier sources. We don't have the texts of them themselves, so it's limited what we can say about them. Kings is more critical of Solomon than Chronicles. It gives full credit to many of his achievements. It generally supports the idea of the Davidic monarchy. It, in general, supports his reputation for wisdom or at least sagacity. But it also makes ample reference to his failings, and particularly his ethical failings, and also to some cases of bad practical judgment. This is particularly true when it's dealing with the latter part of his reign. What are some of the negative indictments in Kings? Corruption, nepotism, kleptocracy, raiding the treasury, economic exploitation of the people, serving personal interests of the king and his retinue above the public interest, corruption. Oppression, a hard hand in the enforcement of law, particularly with reference to conscription and forced labor. Ostentation, Joe Stalin's magnificent constructions in Moscow during the 1930s. Over-the-top building projects. His palace, even the temple, which certainly is over the top, whatever else it may be. Excessive expenditures in financing that construction. Heavy taxation, mentioned repeatedly in the Book of Kings. Foreign wives, many of them. If David had 8 by name and maybe as many as 100, you don't know the names of, Solomon had far more than that.
What does that say about his wisdom?
Well, yeah, well,
What did you
that's
do with
what we're
300
dealing
wives
with.
and 600
That's what we're dealing with. And there were advantages to them, actually. They were often assets diplomatically, but they undermined the whole idea of cultic purity. They introduced, or they promoted the erection of shrines to foreign gods. Foreign wives are worshipped in foreign shrines. He had heavy preference to Southerners. Although the divided kingdom comes after Solomon's reign, as depicted here, the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes were very different from the time of the original conquest. A lot of contemporary scholars think, in fact, they came into Canaan by different routes at different times. That the northern tribes came in and crossed into Canaan under the leadership of Joshua. But the southern tribes migrated, and some people think earlier and some people think later, directly up from the south. Pretty hard to evaluate, but the extent of the different customs in north and south, and the different basic literary subsources that were found there that are later in the literary critical thesis identified as the E strain, which is northern, and the J strain, which is southern, and we won't explore that here. But the northern and southern differences were prominent even before this period. Solomon was from the kingdom of Judah. Solomon reflected the tradition of David's original kingship in Hebron. He appointed Southerners to important positions. He advantaged them in terms of how wealth was distributed. And that was a source of resentment. It kind of winded up. Oh, I should also note, though, in that connection, the Chronicles, which covers the same period ostensibly, is much more generous to David and to Solomon than Kings is, and is probably less historically accurate. And it comes from a much later period, whereas Kings probably was put together 200 years after Solomon's reign. It comes from the post-exilic period. And one of the dominant differences in that period is that monarchy at that time is weak and it's not seen as a threat. The mission of its protagonists is cheerleading, boosterism, whereas kings in a significant way inherits the tradition of Samuel that is suspicious of the monarch, endorses it out of necessity, but not with unqualified eagerness. Solomon's greatest weakness isn't a matter of controversial interpretation, as some of the weaknesses I've mentioned are. It is amply demonstrated by the historical record. Because Solomon is followed, as he was preceded, by a troubled succession. And in his case, it's the death knell of the United Monarchy. The United Monarchy reaches its apogee under Solomon. It reaches its nadir and it disappears. David creates the United Monarchy. Solomon lets it slip away. He's succeeded by his son, Rehoboam, who is the proper heir legally, but clearly turns out not to be the right man for the job. He continues a lot of the problematic features of Solomon's later year. And most critically, he, even more than Solomon, shows preference in appointments and other policies to Southerners. A rival arises in the north, Jeroboam, because they both have bones in their name, sometimes think they're relatives, they are not. He is not a Davidic character. He's a charismatic northern leader with military experience, but he's not of the Davidic line. And he raises a successful rebellion against Solomon's heirs, against specifically Rehoboam. And the northern 10 tribes secede from the larger United Monarchy. Rehoboam continues to reign in the south, as do his descendants, but not with distinction. And many of his descendants have mixed reputations. That kind of sets the stage for when we talk about Josiah later on in the period of the divided monarchy. And a descendant of Davidic monarchs who have various reputations, from the favorable seen in Hezekiah, his great-grandfather, to Manasseh, his grandfather, who was seen as one of the most evil and debauched kings ever to occupy the throne of Judah. Well, before everyone is completely gone, I think I'll pack up my luggage and go myself.
Thank you.
Tell your friends what they
Solomon
missed.
wasn't all that wonderful at choosing successors.
Who?
Well, Solomon didn't manage his success.
No.
well at all.
No, I mean,
Absolutely.
he came out of a disputed succession and created one.
Yeah.
And the first one was resolved by Bathsheba, but there was no Bathsheba to resolve the second one. You know, we have a sense that monarchy is stable. I mean, you know, you're a historian, you can appreciate this. Monarchy is only intermittently stable.
Yes.
And it's punctuated by lots of people who are incapable or tyrannical.
Simply because they're the surviving eldest son.
They're the surviving eldest son, or sometimes not even that, but the
Yeah.
surviving pretender. And in fact, that reputation for stability is unwarranted. It's just that there wasn't a good alternative in many cases.
Thank you.
Yeah,
You're
you
welcome, ma'am.
mentioned the pre-monarchical period when things were bad then too.
Yeah, yep.
Bye-bye.
Bad in a different way.
Yeah.
She's gone.
And you know, when you look at, for instance, Russian history or French history, that altered